I'd like to share a few details about me as your host and the creator of this presentation for anyone who is new. So my name is Heather White. I'm a former Montessori classroom teacher, administrator, and in-home caregiver with more than a decade of experience in the field of Montessori. I currently work as an educational consultant and instructional guide for adult learners who are working to receive their certification in Montessori through the Center for Guided Montessori Studies. And I'm also a blog writer and content creator for several different parenting and Montessori organizations, including the American Montessori Society, Guide and Grow, and Miro's Toys. I hold certifications from the American Montessori Society in the 3 to 6 and 6 to 9 age groups, a master's in education with a concentration in Montessori studies, and an education specialist degree in school psychology. I'm also a nationally certified school psychologist. So during our time together today, we're going to discuss a range of topics, including what it means to be neurodivergent, various types of neurodivergence, the unique benefits of the Montessori environment for students who are neurodivergent, and then ways that as parents and caregivers and educators that we can support students with varying types of neurodivergence, including autism, ADHD, Down syndrome, and language disorders such as dyslexia. I see some comments in the chat, so let me just check. Everyone's just saying hello. It's wonderful for you all to be here. So let's start with what is neurodivergence as a baseline. So formerly considered something that was a problem or something that was abnormal, scientists now really understand that neurodivergence can actually have lots of benefits. Being neurodivergent isn't a disability, it's just a difference in how your brain works. With this shift, practitioners are no longer treating neurodivergence as an illness. Instead, they're viewing them as different methods of learning and processing information. So a similar term is neurodiversity. And this is the idea that it's normal and acceptable for people to have brains that function differently from one another. So there's this spectrum, if you will, of how our brains process information and function. So rather than thinking that there's something wrong or problematic when someone's brain doesn't operate similarly to someone else's, neurodiversity embraces all differences. The concept of neurodiversity recognizes that brain function and behavioral traits are really just indicators of how diverse our human population is. Neurodiversity then can be broken down into 2 subcategories: people who are neurotypical, whose brains function in a way in which we would expect or as is typical, and those who are neurodivergent. So neurodivergence then is that term used to describe when someone's brain processes, learns, and or behaves differently than what is considered typical. There are a lot of different ways that neurodivergence can manifest itself, ranging from very mild ways that most people might not even ever notice, to very obvious ways that might lead a person to behave very differently than what's considered standard within our society. Opposingly then, neurotypical then is the term used to describe a person whose brain processes, learns, and or behaves in a way that we would consider as typical. Neurotypical people usually hit all of their developmental and behavioral milestones at the expected time and around the same time as one another. And that's what's considered standard, right? Is that neurotypicality. Just gonna check the chat. I see some more good mornings. Good everything. Yes, we're from all over, right? It's morning, afternoon, evening. So because this idea of neurodivergence has grown to encompass a range of consistent ways that some brains might work differently than others, there are these different types of ways that neurodivergence might manifest itself. Some of the common examples are shown here. The first is autism. So autism is a neurological and developmental disorder that's known as a spectrum disorder because it can present from mild to severe. ASD is the acronym for autism. So you'll hear me say that throughout the presentation as well. That's autism spectrum disorder. So ASD can affect someone's behavior and emotions and includes a broad set of conditions that might include challenges with socializing or with social skills, exhibiting repetitive behaviors or what we call restricted interests. So something that the person is really, really hyper focused on and really wants to just discuss ad nauseum with others or do ad nauseum. There's never this fatigue. There's this intense interest. It's almost like, excuse me, if you were here a few weeks ago when we talked about sensitive periods, it's very much like a child who's in a sensitive period. They just can't get enough of that activity or whatever it is they're interested in. And then individuals with ASD are likely also to have speech and language difficulties. The next type of neurodivergence that's more popular is ADHD, which is the acronym for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. This is an executive function dysregulation disorder. And that means that these individuals are going to have difficulty or might have difficulty managing their thoughts, attention, behavior, and emotions. People with ADHD might have difficulty with organization. They might be restless or hyperactive. They might have trouble focusing, initiating or completing a task, and might show inappropriate behaviors or what we would consider an inappropriate behavior when they experience very strong emotions. I know there is this idea of ADD as well, attention deficit disorder. We'll get into that a little bit more when we talk about ADHD in depth, but just know that ADHD is now the term that is widely accepted. It's what's in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that physicians and clinicians use for talking about individuals who have these symptoms.
Can I ask a quick question?
Absolutely.
Does a lot of time spent playing video games with children, does that produce ADHD?
Interesting. So it's not going to produce ADHD because ADHD is more a difference in the way the brain responds, but it can intensify symptoms of ADHD. So if a child has ADHD and they're playing video games, they're getting this rapid stimulation. If they're used to that, then when that ends, when the video game stops or a parent says it's time to put the video game away, or if they're not, it's taken away for some reason, maybe as a consequence or because school started, you're probably going to see these heightened responses, right? Where we would consider what we would consider atypical for a child and managing their behavior, managing their emotions, you're probably going to see these very exaggerated responses. The other thing it can do in children who are neurotypical is because they're getting that intense stimulation, that intense rapid stimulation, they may also exhibit these intense behavioral and emotional responses at that the time when the video games end. So there's a similarity there. So it's not causing ADHD, but it might cause these reactions or responses that we see most often in children who are neurodivergent, that we might not expect of children who are neurotypical. That's a great question. So, excuse me. The next category here, the next form of neurodivergence is dyslexia. So this is a form of neurodivergence that involves speaking, reading, and writing. It's typically associated with a misreading, writing or speaking words or letters out of order, but it actually encompasses a lot more than that. For example, it can include confusion with certain letters, difficulty ordering words into sentences, trouble acquiring vocabulary or pronouncing words correctly, and even challenges with following directions. The last category here that we'll focus on today is Down syndrome. And this is a condition in which a person has an extra chromosome. And this extra chromosome alters the development of an individual's body and their brain, causing mental and physical challenges. People with Down syndrome have an IQ usually in the mildly to moderately low range and have these common physical features like a flattened face, almond-shaped eyes, a short neck, and also poor muscle tone. So this is actually the only category that we'll focus on that has those distinguishing physical features. So that's something interesting because You might hear someone say like, oh, it looks like that child has autism. But in reality, there is no physical outward feature that would distinguish or be able to allow someone to distinguish that an individual was on the autism spectrum. Some other types of neurodivergence that we won't necessarily dive into today, but just for you to be aware of, are things like Tourette's syndrome, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, epilepsy, and also chronic mental health disorders like bipolar disorder, OCD, which is obsessive compulsive disorder, and even anxiety and depression. These are all types of neurodivergence. Let's see. I see a question here in the chat. Autism, ADHD, dyslexia, and Down syndrome. Which one is more dangerous or more problematic? That's a great question. So I think it really just depends on the severity, right? So with Down syndrome, if we're talking about a child who has a very low IQ, they might exhibit behaviors as might a child who has autism, right? If we're thinking about that spectrum, it can be mild to very severe. If you have a child who's very severely autistic, just like a child who has a very low IQ, if they have Down syndrome, they might exhibit self-injurious behaviors. They might not be able to verbally communicate. They might be aggressive towards their peers because of this intense frustration and not being able to communicate. The same thing can be expected of certain children with ADHD. If they get really frustrated, they have these heightened emotional responses, or they're having trouble communicating what they want to say or how they feel because of this surge of emotions and all of these thoughts running through their head. You might see these physical outbursts. And so that can be a concern for other children in the classroom. So I think if we're looking at behavioral and emotional responses, those three, it really just depends on the child, but those would be some of the concerns you might see. Dyslexia, though, and some of these other neurodivergent types of neurodivergence, depending on the severity, could also impact a student's academic functioning. So dyslexia is going to make it very challenging for a child, like I said, to read and to write and to communicate verbally. A child with ADHD who's having trouble initiating or finishing tasks, that's obviously, I'm sure you can imagine, going to be troublesome for that child in the classroom. So it really just depends if we're thinking again about neurodiversity being this broad spectrum of how our brains operate and how that impacts our ability to think and act. It really does come down to each individual case. Let's see, Karen says, what about children that are diagnosed as manic depressants? They portray symptoms of being highly elated, heightened excitement, and lots of energy. Would you say that classifies that as ADHD or manic depressant? Yeah, so interestingly, if you're looking at in the classroom, particularly in public schools, but also in private institutions as well, we don't focus so much on the specific diagnoses because we don't have the education or the ability legally to diagnose, right? So as a parent, as a caregiver, and especially as an educator, we're really focusing on those presenting behaviors that we're seeing or the challenges academically. That's what we're focusing on. So we're not focusing on, is it ADHD or is it manic depression? We're focusing on what are the challenges we're seeing and what can we implement to help this child. That distinguishing between whether it's one type of neurodivergence or another, which both of the things you're describing are neurodivergence, right? As I was just saying, those mental health conditions are also a type of neurodivergence because it's the way our brain sometimes develops and also the biochemical nature and biochemical reactions happening in our brain, the way those neurons are firing. So that's really going to have to be either an MD, a doctor, or someone like a psychologist or a psychiatrist who has the ability to make those diagnoses. And then with that information, you can provide that to the school psychologist that works at your child's school, to the child's teacher, And also it can be helpful for yourself to do a bit more research on, now that I know these symptoms I'm seeing, these presenting behaviors, these challenges the child's experiencing, now I know they're correlated with this. This is why they're happening. So is there an intervention that works specifically for that condition, that works more efficiently than another intervention? But again, every child, every individual is different. So it's really important to look at the presenting symptoms and the individual themselves to figure out what kind of supports might be most effective. Let's see, I see another comment here. I'm an English teacher, and in my school, we don't know the parents. So psychologically, how can this affect them and their studies? Yeah, that's a great point. So family history is a big piece of neurodivergence, right? Or any kind of biological effects, because a lot of these things can be and are often tied to genetics. They can be very hereditary. And so not knowing that history, I think that's why it's really important as an educator to get to know your students and to get to know their family so that you understand what might be going on. Let's say, for instance, you have a child in your classroom who's really having a difficult time reading, or maybe even you're a parent and you notice your child is having a really difficult time reading, and all of a sudden your spouse says, you know, I had a really hard time learning to read as well. Then that can be kind of a trigger for you, or kind of a light bulb goes off and you're like, okay, well, there's a pattern here. Maybe we should look into this. So even if a parent doesn't share if they've had a particular diagnosis, if they just share that they've had experienced certain challenges, it can be helpful. So as an educator, without that information, it can take a piece of the puzzle away. But what I would encourage you to do is to really closely observe your students. If you were here a few weeks ago, we talked about the importance of observation and how that's really a foundational piece of the Montessori pedagogy and philosophy, because it really is, it's not just a science. Dr. Montessori talked about it being a science, but also an art. And that's really what allows you to identify who your students are, what their challenges are, what their strengths are, and then you can implement these interventions, these strategies to support them and observe whether it's working or not. Okay, this helps, this didn't really help, so let's try something else. So although I would say that is kind of an added obstacle to overcome, without that piece of the puzzle, I think that observation really is the key to helping you in those situations. Can we label children with learning disabilities and neurodivergent problems? So this is a really interesting question. A lot of parents are very concerned about their child having a label, right? Because that's something that's going to stick with that child most likely for the rest of their lives. So as an educator, as a parent, we don't have the legal, as a parent, if you would like to say that your child has something, you're obviously more than able to do so. There won't be any legal ramifications. As an educator, there very well could be. If I said to you as an educator, or even as a school psychologist, right? If you remember on my introductory slide, I mentioned I'm a nationally certified school psychologist. Even as a school psychologist, I cannot tell a parent, your child has attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Your child is autistic. Your child is dyslexic. I don't have that authority because I don't have the training and the certification. Again, you need to be an MD, a medical doctor, or you need to be a psychologist who has a doctorate degree, or a psychiatrist in order to make diagnoses. What I can say, and what we all can say as parents, and especially as educators to parents, is I noticed that your child is presenting, is exhibiting some behaviors. They're having a hard time finishing things in the classroom. It seems like they have a lot of trouble kind of inhibiting their impulses. They shout out when we're having a lesson rather than raising their hand. When they get frustrated, they have a tendency to push their peers or to pinch their peers or hit their peers. So I'm telling the parent the things that I'm seeing, right? It connects back to that importance of observation. I'm telling them what I'm seeing, and record keeping is so vital. Keep really detailed notes of what you're seeing, specifically when you saw it, right? In a notebook, maybe write the date and exactly what you saw, very objectively, no subjective interpretations, just what you saw. And then use that in your communication with parents, telling them what you're seeing. And oftentimes the school psychologist might say those things and say also, your child is exhibiting these behaviors that are often correlated with or characteristic of ADHD. However, this is not an official diagnosis. So that's kind of how we have that conversation within the school system when we don't have the authority to label children or diagnose them, but we're trying to get them extra support services to make sure that they succeed. Because in the school systems, especially here in the US, in order for a child to receive additional supports, they need to either have an IEP, an individualized education program or plan, or a 504 plan. And these are really just documents that allow the child to receive extra support. But without the testing, without those notes from a school psychologist saying these are the things we see, they're not able to have that additional support. So that's why it's important for that to happen, but not necessarily to give them the label like your child is autistic, your child has ADHD. That would come from a psychologist, psychiatrist, or a medical doctor. I'm going to answer the questions that are here in the chat, and then we'll keep going and we'll come back. Does neurodivergence as a result of neurotransmitter oversecretion or less secretion, does imbalance of neurotransmitters lead to neurodivergence? So there are some types of neurodivergence that are related to oversecretion or less secretion. ADHD specifically, you do see, and also those mental health conditions. You see either an overabundance of or oversecretion of certain chemicals, overfiring, or less secretion of those neuro and biological chemicals. So it really just depends on the individual type of neurodivergence. What are the signs and symptoms of neurodivergence in children? We're going to get to that when we dive deep into each of these different types in just a moment. As an e-teacher too, I think to observe each of these types of neurodivergences takes a certain amount of time, about half a year, both at home and at school, until the diagnosis is given by specialists in the field. Absolutely. That's why your notes as an educator are really going to come in handy, because even a school psychologist is going to rely on those and need to do their own observations as well, because these things are a continuing pattern over a period of time. So it's not just in one moment, not just in one situation, not just in the classroom, but not at home or vice versa. They do need to be generalized. These things need to happen in multiple situations or environments. And that's often a big frustration for teachers, is that it takes a while for children to receive these additional support services to qualify for an IEP or a 504 plan, because we need the data to indicate that the child does need that. So the more data you can provide, the more observations you've done, the more helpful. I have a question. I'm a primary teacher and have two students. One has a kind of dyslexia whose parents would not agree that he has a problem. He doesn't recognize words, always has a million spelling mistakes. How can I help him? Second is an autistic child who has just started puberty and has become more aggressive. Other kids are really disturbed. What can we do to help him? Some students whose math and English reading and writing is poor. Which group of neurological disorders would we put them in? So the first two questions I want to place on hold until we go and dive deeper into those categories and see if you have additional questions, because we're going to cover ways to help students in each of these categories. If a student is just struggling with math, they might have dyscalculia. If they're struggling with math and English together, and their writing is poor as well, they might not have a type of neurodivergence. They might just have a learning challenge, which would be a difference in the way the brain's processing information, but it wouldn't be a specific one of these categories we're describing. All right, I'm going to pause there and come back to the chat in just a moment, and we'll keep going. So if we're looking at Montessori specifically, the Montessori environment and its materials are really helpful for all children, but neurodivergent students in particular may uniquely benefit from these types of learning environments because they naturally address some of their challenges. So although Montessori may not be the best fit for every child, there are definitely many aspects of the pedagogy that harness the potential to really benefit neurodivergent students. For instance, the minimalist design that's very characteristic of Montessori classrooms not only just adds this visual appeal, but it also encourages simplicity over stimulation, which helps neurodivergent students who are having trouble regulating their emotions feel less anxious, less frustrated when they're trying to absorb all of these stimuli at one time. Consider something as simple as the change to a natural soothing light source, right? Like lamps, or only having half of the overhead lights on, as opposed to that constant hum and really intense brightness of fluorescent lighting that is often used in traditional classrooms. The freedom of movement that exists in a Montessori classroom and is encouraged is also vital for students who might have sensory or movement needs. Think about that child who might have ADHD and has trouble with impulse control, right? They have this need for movement. They're hyperactive, they're wiggly. Being able to get up and walk around when they need to, and walk and get something from the shelf and come back, to get water when they need it, to take a bathroom break when they need it, maybe even to just get up and take a little walk around the classroom in between each work or activity they're doing. That's really beneficial to them. The Montessori materials are also really carefully designed so that they isolate a single skill. It's called isolation of difficulty. And they include self-correction. So they're self-correcting materials. They have a control of error that allows students to more easily focus and remain on task when they're doing these activities. In a more traditional setting, the work that children may be doing often includes several steps that require a teacher to guide the child through them. And for a neurodivergent student, they might even need additional support in knowing and navigating those activities successfully, knowing what to do next. What do I do after this? And that can really lead to feelings of discouragement or frustration for them. Students in a Montessori classroom also don't typically view their neurodivergent classmates as different, because there's such a unique blend. There's this multi-age nature of the classroom and this very individualized approach to education where each child is getting what they need specifically, that allows each child to develop at their own pace, to explore their own interests, and to have their individual needs met. So it's not something that really sticks out as it might in a traditional setting. However, it's important to note that despite the inherent benefits of Montessori, additional assistance from the guide or support staff, maybe a one-on-one guide in the classroom, or even outside support, maybe an occupational therapist, a speech and language pathologist providing speech and language therapy, an occupational therapist. All of these things might be necessary for neurodivergent students to really experience the greatest level of success. So I wanted to dive a little bit more deeply into this idea of the multi-age classroom. Research really strongly supports, and again, we had a conversation about this a few weeks ago, if you were able to be here for that. But research really strongly supports this hallmark practice of having multi-age classrooms. This unique kind of facet of Montessori classrooms not only allows younger children to learn from their older classmates, but it also provides neurodivergent students with learning opportunities because they can observe their neurotypical peers and see how they navigate through different academic and social situations. So by law here in the States, it's required that neurodivergent students are placed in what's called the least restrictive environment. The acronym often used there is the LRE. And this is a legal term that really means it's within something called the Individuals with Disabilities Act. And it serves as a principle for deciding the classroom placement that best meets the needs of neurodivergent students. So the law specifically states, to the maximum extent appropriate, children with disabilities are educated with children who are not disabled, and special classes, separate schooling, or other removal of children with disabilities from the regular educational environment occurs only when the nature of the severity of the disability of a child is such that education in regular classes with the use of supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. So what they're looking for is services and supports provided in the classroom, or maybe even outside of the classroom by these instructors or support staff like occupational therapists, speech and language pathologists, that allows the child to stay in their classroom with their neurotypical peers. So including neurodivergent students in a Montessori classroom not only benefits them because they can learn from their neurotypical peers, but it gives them these really important learning opportunities to the neurotypical students as well. And what it means to be inclusive and accepting, it really gives them this picture, everyone in the classroom, neurotypical or neurodivergent, a picture of what the real world looks like, where individuals work and socialize with people of all ages, backgrounds, and dispositions. So there really is just such a unique benefit to this practice. I'm going to pause and take a look at the chat. So I see, could you give an example of how to handle each one? Yep, we're going to get to that in just a minute. In my school, students come to school without breakfast and have to stay there until 2 p.m. Is that pedagogically correct? So I'm going to go back to Maslow here and Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And what Maslow said is that if our biological needs are not met, meaning we're not getting enough sleep, we haven't had enough nutrition, then we're not able to meet our other needs, which basically means that a child isn't really going to be able to live up to their greatest academic potential. They might have social challenges because they're not going to be functioning in a typical manner socially either. Maybe difficulty regulating their emotional responses because they have this unmet biological need. They have this hunger. If you think about yourself, right? I know for me, if I'm tired or I'm hungry, I might be, I might snap at my husband or be a little more on edge than normal, have a hard time concentrating. So it's the same for our students as well. In the Montessori classroom, it's very typical to have snack in the classroom available that the children can eat when they feel hungry. We help them kind of tune into their body's needs as well. And make it more of a community effort. They help set up snack, whether that's preparing things, cutting them, chopping them, washing fruits and vegetables. But then also the idea, because a lot of people have the question, well, what if a child eats too much? And there's this very natural consequence in this conversation that if you eat more than your share, then your peers don't have any. And, how would you feel if that was you in that situation? So I don't know if that's a possibility, but that might be something to look into. We also have here in the States, and again, this might be something to talk to your directors or your administrators about. We also have breakfast that is offered to certain students who qualify or have that need if there's a financial need in the family. So maybe that's an option as well. I do see a request for my email address. It will be displayed at the end, so everyone will get that as well. All right, so let's dive a little bit more deeply into these 4 most common types of neurodivergence that we were covering and how they can be supported in the classroom. So we'll start with autism. Again, autism is really just an abbreviated form of the name of the neurodivergence, which is autism spectrum disorder, which is sometimes also known as ASD. Like we discussed previously, autism is a neurological and developmental disability that involves persistent challenges in social communication, a restricted interest, and repetitive behaviors. Early signs of autism might be recognized by parents or caregivers, or even pediatricians, uh, sometimes even before a child is 1 year old. But in some cases, the functional impairment might be mild. And so it might be harder to distinguish. And sometimes it's not until a child starts school that these deficits or challenges become a little bit more pronounced when educators start to compare children to their peers. Social communication deficits might include challenges responding to one's emotions or the emotions of others. So a lot of times, when children see that someone is sad, they also feel sad. Like if their mom cries, they start to cry. Or if someone is angry, maybe they're scared, they get a little timid. You might not see those same responses in a child or an individual who has autism or is autistic. They might avoid eye contact. They might have scripted speech. Some people refer to it as very robotic. They are very literal. They interpret things very literally. So humor is a bit of a challenge for them often. And they have difficulty with reciprocal conversations. That back and forth conversation with someone is often a challenge. The restricted interest and repetitive behaviors could be in flexibility, difficulty coping with changes. So those transition times in a classroom might be a challenge. Or when a parent goes out of town, or you have a field trip, anything that's out of the ordinary. They might be overly focused on very niche subjects. It could be something like they're obsessed or seem obsessed or highly interested in raccoons or trains or cars. They might have a sensory hypersensitivity. So let's say tags in their clothing, certain fabrics, a response to cold or hot stimuli. They might have stereotypical movements like hand flapping, which looks like this, or rocking. They kind of rock back and forth. They also might spin in circles. And then they also could arrange things in a very particular manner. So they might line things up, stack things. It's important with this, though, sometimes parents see this and get concerned with toddlers. That's a really typical toddler behavior. So if that's the only thing you're seeing, that's not really a concern. There's actually something called a positioning schema, which schemas are pretty similar to sensitive periods, just not specific to Montessori. But that is a very typical schema, the positioning schema. So just lining things up or stacking them isn't really something to be concerned about. It would be when that occurs with other presenting challenges or presenting symptoms as well. In the classroom specifically, an autistic student might have trouble communicating effectively with their peers or with their teacher, might have challenges with organization, time management, their memory, emotional regulation. And these things might make it difficult for these students to initiate tasks, to prioritize assignments, and to cope with their mistakes. They may become very easily overstimulated. So with all of that being said, here are 6 ways that you can support autistic students in the classroom, specifically in a Montessori classroom is what we're looking at here. So the first you'll see repeated, it works with many of these types of neurodivergence, is to be warm, encouraging, and positive. Although as educators, we should always exhibit these qualities, it's imperative that these feelings are made really clear to autistic students who might be feeling discouraged or frustrated. So acknowledging and validating their feelings, encouraging them, providing praise, although praise is not something that's typical in a Montessori classroom because we want children to develop intrinsic motivation, that praise may be necessary for children who are autistic. Giving them very specific observations of what you see can be motivating for them and really allow them to feel encouraged and to reach their full potential. The second way that you can support them is to allow sensory and movement breaks. A freedom of movement is a natural part of Montessori, like we talked about, and it's really important for autistic students to be able to listen to their bodies and to take breaks when they're feeling like they need it, when they're having trouble focusing, when they're getting frustrated or discouraged, whether that's after they've completed a work or maybe even in the middle of an activity. Autistic students might also need opportunities for additional sensory input through things like jumping on a trampoline. You can have a little trampoline right outside the door, carrying a heavy watering can to water plants. Those things provide what's called their opportunities for heavy work. They provide this deep proprioceptive input that children often need who are autistic. And then also providing support for task initiation, so for starting tasks and redirecting them back to tasks. So it might be helpful to set out a student's first work of the day at a specific workspace you think they might be able to concentrate at or that they particularly like, or gather the materials they need to start a task like a notebook and a pencil, maybe even having a list of the materials they need so that they can be a little bit more independent, but it gives them some more focus, or a short checklist of the steps in a task to complete. They might need additional redirections back to work though, if they get a little distracted or discouraged. It could be something like gently placing your hand on their shoulder as you walk by, tapping their workspace just a couple times to redirect them back to the task they're doing, making eye contact and smiling at them. All of these things can give them a nonverbal reminder. I do see the chat. I'm going to come to that in just a minute, but let's finish off these last 3 ways to support autistic students in the classroom. So the next way is to provide prompts when transitions are happening or changes in routine are going to happen. Autistic students are really likely to have difficulty transitioning from one thing to the next and adjusting to these changes in routine. So we can support them in these times by providing prompts that prepare them so they know what to expect. It could be a verbal reminder, something like, when you finish that work, it's time to clean up to get ready to go home. Or you can give them a time warning. You can say something like, in 5 minutes, while you're pointing to the clock and showing them what that looks like. Some people use visual timers that allow the child to see the time diminishing. It's like a kitchen timer, but it changes color so that they can see that time going down. So they have a better idea if they don't have a solid concept of time. So you say, in 5 minutes, when this timer goes off, or when this, the minute hand gets to the 5, it will be time for us to go to lunch, just, whatever the activity is going to be. And just that it's important to give these prompts for transitions, it's also really vital to inform these students when there's going to be change in a daily routine that's normal and expected. So if you have a guest coming in, maybe for a special lesson, or they're going to read a book, you have a story time, maybe recess is going to happen earlier because it's really hot outside and you need to go before the heat of the day. Explaining these things as soon as you can, and then providing a few reminders before the change happens can be helpful. A visual schedule is also really helpful. So when I was an elementary teacher, I had a written schedule with the time on the board of what was happening that day so the children could all see it when they came in. For young children who might be toddlers even, or early childhood age, you could use pictures either of them or pictures of a scenario and show them the sequence of the events. This can even be helpful for children getting ready in the morning, or that bedtime routine, right? First we eat dinner, then we play, then we take a bath, then we read a book, and then we go to bed. And you can allow them to take the pieces off as they're accomplished, and that helps them be more involved and know what to expect. These children may also need help with organization. They might have difficulty remaining organized. You can provide them support by recommending a system that might help them with this organization. Maybe they have a special spot in the classroom or in their home with a basket for their things. In the classroom, maybe they just have a basket they bring to their workspace that has everything they need in it, their notebooks, their pencils. For larger projects or assignments, breaking it down into smaller pieces, like first we're going to do this, then we're going to do this, whether that's a checklist or they come and check in with you after each piece is helpful. And then finally, placing emphasis on grace and courtesy lessons. So this is something in a Montessori classroom, it's really social skills. So although we introduce these things naturally in a Montessori classroom, these might be lessons on turn taking in a conversation, respecting someone's personal space, making eye contact. Autistic students might need a little bit more direct instruction and explicit instruction, even individually, or more role playing where they can be involved in practice and seeing others practice as well. Visual aids can also be really helpful for them in this area. All right, let me check the chat and see what we have going on here. Let's see. Thank you, Jean. I'm glad to have you here. Welcome. I see a question here. If access and using IT devices like a phone, a tablet, smartboard, especially for very young individuals belonging to the so-called alpha generation, the addict persons without intelligent control and self-control may grow the number of sick persons, including some of those you speak. It is heard that Sweden started a new attitude, a traditional teaching. We use a blended combined teaching and learning. However, we observe some negative features in their behavior. Yeah, we touched on that a little bit at the beginning. I'm not sure if maybe you came in a little bit later. So using these devices, right, whether it's kind of the same idea with video games, right, and using a tablet, using a phone, they're getting this very rapid stimulation. They're getting the input even from just the screen. That's why sometimes people change their screen so that it's a black background, so it's not such a bright, like they put it on dark mode or night mode. It's not such a bright visual input that you're getting. So that can trigger certain responses in the brain. It's not necessarily going to cause these types of neurodivergence, but it may cause symptoms or challenges that are similar to those that are exhibited by children who have these types of neurodivergences, most definitely. I see a note here. Oh, I'm glad you're enjoying it. Thank you for being here. Hopefully I pronounce this correctly. Is it Wandimu from Ethiopia, a special needs and inclusive education lecturer? All right, let's go ahead and keep going. So the next category here of neurodivergence we'll focus on is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, also known as ADHD. And this is one of the most common types of neurodivergence affecting children. It's estimated that 8.4% of children have ADHD, and characteristically, ADHD is more common among boys than girls, but this might be a result of more noticeable behaviors. They might exhibit those characteristics or presenting characteristics that are more easily identifiable. The hyperactivity, the wiggliness, right, fidgetiness, where girls may exhibit different characteristics or symptoms that kind of lie under the radar. Maybe they just have that challenge in remaining focused. They have that inattentive type, and we'll cover in just a minute what that means. So according to Raina Parikh, who is an MD, many ADHD symptoms such as high activity levels, difficulty remaining still for long periods of time, and limited attention spans are very common to young children in general. And I'm sure for those of you who are educators and parents, you're thinking, yes, they have trouble remaining focused. They have trouble sitting still. The difference that Raina says in children with ADHD is that their hyperactivity and inattention are noticeably greater than what's expected for their age, and it causes distress and or problems functioning at home, at school, and or with friends. So in order to receive a diagnosis of ADHD, a child has to experience real difficulty in at least 2 settings, like home and school, for a period of at least 6 months. So that's that longevity we were talking about, of where you really need to be documenting things because it has to be persistent over a period of time. And there are 3 different types of ADHD. There's an attentive type, hyperactive or impulsive type, and combined type. Common symptoms of inattentive type are difficulty remaining focused on tasks or activities, problems with organization, distractibility, and lack of attention to detail. And common symptoms of that hyperactive impulsive type are things like fidgeting, difficulty remaining seated, frequent movement, constant talking, and a lack of impulse control. And then that combined type is really a mix of symptoms from the other two types. ADHD is often first recognized in when children start school because it will lead to disruptions in the classroom or with difficulty completing schoolwork. The symptoms of ADHD, like inability to focus, difficulty remaining seated, and lack of impulse control, can make it pretty challenging for a child with this diagnosis to do well in school. It might be difficult for them to start an assignment, to remain focused, to complete that task fully. Time management, organization, and planning skills that are necessary for children to complete a task are also really likely to be impacted in individuals with ADHD. And they might also have trouble engaging with their peers because they have this impulsiveness and these heightened emotions. So I did want to touch on what I mentioned earlier. Some people still refer to ADD or attention deficit disorder. So according to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is what physicians and psychologists and psychiatrists use to diagnose these different conditions, ADD no longer exists. Previously, there was ADHD and ADD separately. ADHD had a hyperactive component and ADD did not. Now ADD no longer exists, and they've just classified that ADHD, there are 3 different types. So that inattentive type of ADHD is what was formerly known as ADD. So that's just something interesting to note there. And I forgot to mention with the autism spectrum disorder, people often used to refer to Asperger's syndrome, which was really considered mild presenting symptoms similar to autism. And that diagnosis no longer exists either. It's really just looking at that spectrum, and you could have mild presenting symptoms to highly impactful, where you might say someone is high functioning or low functioning. So just something interesting to note. All right, let's check the chat before we move on to ways to support children with ADHD. Let's see. Oh, I'm so sorry that you were having internet troubles, John. Winfred Bosso, we're glad to have you here. Hi, Paulette. Thank you for joining. I see Jean, Alex, Pierre. My question is, what type of pedagogy can we use to teach a kind of children? So what I'm focusing on mostly is how the Montessori pedagogy really is beneficial for these students. As a Montessori guide and a Montessorian for nearly 15 years now, I really think and have seen this philosophy and pedagogy so helpful with children with all types of neurodivergence. So that's where I'm speaking from. But I think you can really adapt a lot of these supports with any type of pedagogy to help children in the classroom. Recent studies in Australia found that drinking camel milk is a cure for autism, including autism spectrum disorder, which is the most severe case for autism. So autism and autism spectrum disorder are the same thing. It's just a shortened form of that diagnosis. I hadn't heard that. That's very interesting. There's some other studies that some believe have been falsified that say things like vaccinations cause autism. It's definitely worth doing your own research and seeing. I don't know anything about the camel milk. That's interesting. I'll have to look into that. Deanne is having some audio troubles. So I don't know if Dr. Lambert or if one of the people here, if it's Antonella or Clara, might be able to give Deanne some recommendations.
I'll go ahead and post a note in chat about that.
Awesome, thank you. All right, so let's keep going. We'll take a look at ways to support children with ADHD. So you'll notice a lot of overlap in the strategies for supporting autistic students, and that's because some of the presenting challenges are the same. Those exaggerated emotional responses, right? So the first is being warm, encouraging, and positive. So with students with ADHD, they can often become discouraged and frustrated, just like those who are autistic. So making sure that you're acknowledging and validating the child's feelings, providing that specific praise about things you're observing can provide them that extra nudge and motivation they need to reach their full potential. Again, sensory and movement breaks. So that freedom of movement occurs naturally in a Montessori classroom. But for children with ADHD, especially if they have that hyperactivity component, or they have that hyperactive impulsive type or combined type, they might really need those movement breaks to get those wiggles out, right? Whether that's in the middle of an activity, at the end of a task, and they might need those same opportunities for additional sensory input, that heavy work we talked about, like jumping on a trampoline or carrying that heavy watering can. And then again, providing support for task initiation redirection. So as I'm sure you can imagine, with children who have a hard time staying on task, completing a task, or even starting a task, right? If we're talking about executive functioning, it's in that frontal lobe of our brain, right here behind our foreheads, and that's where all those things come into play. And that's what children with ADHD are struggling with. So again, whether you give them nonverbal reminders to redirect them back to task, maybe you have that child sitting closer to you so you can, smile at them or point to their work so that they have that nonverbal cue to return to what they were doing. Giving them something that they can check off each component or each task within a larger project. Maybe having a basket they could bring to their workspace with all of their belongings, or even setting up their workspace at the beginning of the day with everything that they need, that notebook, pencil, markers, just kind of takes that added challenge away for them. They can just come in and get started. So 3 additional ways you can support students with ADHD: providing those same prompts for transition and changes in routine. Just like children who are autistic, children with ADHD are likely to have difficulty transitioning and adjusting to changes in routine. So giving them those prompts before a transition happens, or giving them as much notice as possible when a routine or something is going to be different, can be really helpful. It really helps them prepare for that. And again, those visual schedules or visual timers are helpful with that. Helping them with organization is key. Again, that part of that executive functioning is a difficulty with organization. So maybe you have that basket in the classroom that has all of their supplies in it so they can go to one space instead of many, or giving them ways to break down really large assignments into more manageable pieces. And the last piece here that's different for supporting students with ADHD is allowing self-pacing. So the Montessori method really encourages what we call following the child. And this allows them to set their own pace for their learning. Applying this principle for children with ADHD gives them the freedom to take the time that they need to acclimate to a project and to complete it. It really eliminates that frustration that might develop when a child feels rushed to complete a task, especially if you're thinking about in an inclusive, more traditional setting where children are all doing the same thing at the same time. That child that needs the opportunity for a little bit extra time to complete a task or to get started, to even initiate the task, that can be really frustrating and discouraging for them. So just like it's important to maybe give them a little time to get extra time to get started, it's really important to give them extended time for those extra breaks that they might need, or to allow for the fact that they might have difficulty concentrating. Okay, so I see, is it possible to teach children with neurodivergence in an inclusive setting? Absolutely. And like I mentioned earlier, there's actually a legality here in the United States that requires that we do so. That's that least restrictive environment. We talked about the LRE, that's a part of the Individuals with Disabilities Act, which you could look up. It's under IDEA, IDEA. And so it's absolutely possible to teach children who are neurodivergent in a more traditional inclusive setting, depending upon the challenges that they're exhibiting and the presenting symptoms or behaviors. So for instance, if you have a child who's self-injurious or who is exhibiting aggressive behaviors with other students, obviously the safety of the entire student body is a factor. So they may need to be in a separate setting where they can receive more specialized support, more one-on-one support, and to ensure that they remain safe and to ensure that other students remain safe. Or if the neurodivergence is such, like let's talk about dyslexia. If the challenges with reading are such that the child is unable to function in the classroom, they might need more specialized one-on-one support to understand instructions and directions, to complete tasks. And that might be when you need to look at a separate setting. However, what's wonderful in a lot of Montessori settings is that children are allowed to have one-on-one guides. So let's say that child who is exhibiting self-injurious behaviors or aggression to others, they might have a behavior therapist come in and be in the classroom with them nearby to implement some of those interventions to help in those situations when those aggressive or self-injurious behaviors were exhibited. For that child who has dyslexia, who has a hard time understanding and following directions or completing tasks that require reading, that guide may come in and sit near them. And when they're needed to read instructions or to clarify a task, they're there for that. So that's a way that you could still allow that children who are neurodivergent to be in a more inclusive setting. I see, can autism be outgrown? And is there any way they can grow out of it? And do they get to live a normal life anytime? Great question. So unfortunately, because these are differences in the way the brain and the biological chemistry operates, a child who is autistic or has ADHD or is dyslexic or has Down syndrome will always have Down syndrome or have ADHD or be autistic or have dyslexia. However, that's not to say that they can't live a normal life. There are many individuals who have ADHD, who are autistic, who have Down syndrome, who are dyslexic that live perfectly normal lives. And there are individuals who are dyslexic that are authors, that are speakers, that actually the school psychologist that I worked under for quite some time and learned from is dyslexic, as is her daughter, who is a school psychologist. She owns her own practice and leads other school psychologists and helps thousands of parents and children a year. So absolutely, it is possible for individuals who are neurodivergent to lead normal lives. Again, it really just depends on the type of neurodivergence and the severity of what it might impact.
Heather White, we have a student who studies autism, and she's actually now working with a clinic in England where they're doing electrodes through the brain to unblock certain areas of the brain, and it's curing autism.
Interesting. Is that similar, Dr. Lambert, do you know, to neurofeedback?
It's similar because you're hooking up electrodes,
but
right? It's more specific where they're doing a brain scan. They do a brain scan to find out where the blockages are in the pathways in the brain, and then they're using electricity to break through those pathways.
Wow, that's fascinating. That's incredible. I would love to read more about that.
And it looks like it's taking about 4 to 8 sessions to make it complete.
Interesting. And that's in England, you said?
Yes.
Well, there you go. Thank you for sharing, Dr. Lambert. I'm so glad you shared that.
So I'll be in touch with our student who's doing the research now. Yeah,
I would love to hear more. Raphael says, good afternoon from Nigeria. Thank you for being here. PhD student in digital health and health informatics. I work with the state government at Ministry of Health and an adjunct lecturer. Oh, thank you so much. I'm glad it's interesting for you. Thank you for being here. Helen says, I once taught a child who had ADHD. One of the days he was throwing tantrums, I took him to the school trampoline. He jumped for a complete hour without stopping, and I started getting worried he might faint because I couldn't believe anyone could jump on the trampoline for that long. I eventually took him back to the class, and he was really loud with his cries. And my boss told me to take him back to the trampoline so other learners wouldn't get distracted. And my calculation of him jumping on the trampoline before the close of the school day was 2 hours plus, and he still didn't look tired. I was the one who looked worn out. How can I help such a child if I should meet any child like this again, besides using the trampoline? Yeah, so a lot of children who have ADHD, because children have more energy than we do as adults to begin with often, and children who have ADHD, particularly that hyperactive impulsive type, it seems like you could describe them as an Energizer bunny, like they just never tire. They keep going and going and going. So things like that can be helpful. Obviously, you do need to have other strategies for them to get their energy out so that they can still be in the classroom. One, not as a distraction to their peers or a disruption to the environment, but also because they need to be doing learning and other academic activities as well. So you could try to look for ways that they could get that movement in the classroom, things that have been helpful with other students. And again, everyone is different. A fidget or a stress ball that they can squeeze, something that they can keep doing that movement, but still be attending to something else. There are different types of seating that they can bounce in a chair, or there's wobble chairs that they can wobble back and forth while they're seated at a desk. Some people can put, or often put, the exercise bands from one leg of a desk to the other that the children can push and pull back with their legs to give them that movement that's going to give them that heavy work, that deep proprioceptive input like a trampoline would as well. So those are all ways that you might be able to meet that need while still keeping that child in the classroom and giving you a little bit of a break as well so that you're able to stay in the environment too. All right, let's take a look at Down syndrome. So Down syndrome is a genetic condition, like I said, where a child has an individual has an extra chromosome. So typically, we are all born with 46 chromosomes. Individuals with Down syndrome have an extra copy of one of their chromosomes. It's chromosome 21. And this extra chromosome alters the development of that individual's body and their brain that can often present and cause different mental and physical challenges. So like I said before, individuals with Down syndrome usually have an IQ in the mildly to moderately low range, and they have those common physical features like a flattened face, almond-shaped eyes, a short neck, and poor muscle tone. And Down syndrome can also impact learning abilities in a few different ways. The mild to moderate intellectual impairment can cause things like delays in speech and delays in motor skills. Small muscle activities like handwriting are likely affected. Most students with Down syndrome have short-term or working memory challenges that make it a little more difficult for them to access, understand, and process information at the same speed as their peers. And these students may also need help with care of self activities, things like dressing themselves, brushing their hair, brushing their teeth, putting on their shoes, using the restroom. All of those things can be a challenge often because of those motor impairments. Again, if we're talking about can these individuals live a normal life or typical life, there are lots of individuals with Down syndrome who do all of the things I just described independently. So again, it just depends on each individual's situation and presenting characteristics and challenges and strengths. I see something in the chat here. I see a note in the chat that with students who are neurodivergent, there's something called curative pedagogy because this helps some students with their learning. Thank you for sharing. Okay, so 6 ways to support students with Down syndrome in the classroom. Again, some overlap from how to support students with ADHD and autism. That warm, encouraging, positive nature is essential for these children for the same reasons, because they can become discouraged or frustrated when something's challenging. So that praise, that encouragement can really help them reach their full potential. Providing them opportunities to serve as role models, social skills role models in particular. So students with Down syndrome typically have incredible social skills. So using this strength to allow them to become a role model or a leader for their peers in regards to socialization really gives them a boost of confidence and an opportunity to really shine. They might not be the best when it comes to math or reading, and there might be peers in their classroom who are their role models or leaders in that area. But this is an opportunity where they can become a role model or leader, and that's really motivating and encouraging. Placing a strong emphasis on visual learning is a great way to support students with Down syndrome. So in all possible situations, having visual aids like demonstrations, pictures, illustrations are really helpful for students with Down syndrome to understand and process information. For works that have a lot of written language, creating corresponding picture cards or visual directions, illustrations can be really helpful. And that visual schedule we talked about before for helping students who are autistic or who have ADHD with those transitions and routine changes are really helpful for students with Down syndrome, because it allows them to understand what's happening without the written component that might be a little bit harder for them to process. 3 additional ways to support students with Down syndrome. The first here is providing individual motivation. So although intrinsic motivation is highly encouraged in Montessori, taking the time to foster motivation for students with Down syndrome is crucial to helping them really stay engaged with their learning. So finding ways that you can acknowledge their work and encouraging them that feel really organic, natural, and are authentic. Because they can pick up when you're really just doing it because you feel like you need to. So really being authentic about the encouragement you're providing and the motivation you're providing is important. Ensuring proper supports are in place within the prepared environment. So if you were here a few sessions ago, we talked about the prepared environment, and that's really setting up this space that's designed to meet each student's needs. So for students with Down syndrome, they might need additional supports within that prepared environment in order to be successful. So making sure that the student has a choice of different workspaces within the classroom where a table is at the appropriate height for them. You want their feet to be able to rest flat on the floor and their back against the back of the chair, because that's going to give them the muscle support that they need. Remember, we talked about they have poor muscle tone often, so that prevents muscle fatigue. Providing something that they can lean against, maybe it's a pillow or a cushion in their chair if they can't lean all the way back in the chair, is really important. And also giving them that to lean against if they're working on the floor. It's very common in a Montessori classroom for children to work at rugs on the floor because there are these large works. So having something they can lean against to help support them is really important, so that they don't experience that muscle fatigue. And then allowing self-pacing. Like I said, the Montessori method encourages following the child and letting each child set their own pace for learning. Applying this principle for children with Down syndrome gives them the freedom to get acclimated to different things. They might have this anxiety. They might feel discouraged if they've struggled with similar tasks in the past. And so giving them the time that they need, or the extra time to process information, to respond. If you're having a conversation with them, really making sure you're pausing long enough for them to process what you're saying and respond and articulate themselves is really helpful, not only to ensure they comprehend instructions or directions, but also to show the respect to them, that you're giving them the opportunity, the time that they need, and want to hear their response and what they have to say and think.
Hello, Heather White. We're kind of running past time.
Yes.
You you can come back and finish up the presentation on another time.
Okay.
So yeah, it's probably
And
good to go ahead and stop the class now.
okay, I'm just gonna pop up on the screen. So we didn't get to dyslexia, and the presentation is available for anyone who needs it or is interested. These are some great resources if you are interested in learning more. There's some books about Montessori inclusion and strategies for children with learning differences in the classroom and at home. And then for someone who is asking for my contact information, there it is as well.